And welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes a todos, todas. Thank you for joining us on a Thursday evening. I'm sure you will not regret your time in this talk. It is with great honor to present Dr. Roopika Risam in her talk titled Beyond the Dots, Data Stories of Migration. To briefly introduce her, Risam is Chair of Secondary and Higher Education and Associate Professor of Education and English at Salem State University. Her research interests lie at the intersections of post-colonial and African diaspora studies, humanities knowledge infrastructures, and digital humanities. Risam is the author of New Digital Worlds, Post-Colonial Digital Humanities in Theory, Praxis, and Pedagogy, and co-editor of Intersectionality in Digital Humanities and the Digital Black Atlantic for the Debates in the Digital Humanities series. I'm thrilled to introduce you all to a woman of color and amazing digital humanist that has been making tremendous efforts to make academia and public and digital humanities spaces to disrupt the colonial violence that have shaped and limited the way our stories need to be heard, expressed, and be represented. She combines the humanities and the digital, the theory into the praxis, to create a digital record that puts social justice at its center, to bring the unheard and unrepresented stories, to create counter stories for us to produce our own knowledges. Having the opportunity to work alongside Risam in Torn Apart Separados and reviews in digital humanities has enabled me to learn and keep doing the work in and out of academia for better worlds to be. Without further ado, I pass the word to Dr. Risam, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Sylvia. And thank you so much to Brian for the invitation to be here, as well as to Dave. I'm really happy to see all of you and appreciate you taking the time to join us. I'm going to talk today about the ethics of data visualization when working in the context of migration and what we should be thinking about when we're considering how to tell stories with data. You may share my excitement and enthusiasm about data visualization. There have just been so many remarkable advances and thinking in technology that have given us accessible and portable data formats, and so much great work by developers who've created an array of out-of-the-box tools that allow even the most novice users to create data visualizations and very impressive data visualizations. Actually, if you use something like Tableau, it's literally as easy as connect your data, drag and drop some data, and boom, you have a basic data visualization. But this seeming accessibility of data visualization is both a blessing and a curse. There is, of course, so much potential for what we can do when working with data visualization, but there's also so much that can go wrong. For the last 2 years, I served as the co-chair of the Data Visualization Society's Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And we were really invested in, but faced a lot of challenges with getting members and sometimes even board members interested and committed to exploring what can go wrong with data visualization, particularly when working with vulnerable populations. From this work, I've sort of detected this phenomenon where whatever major current event that's generating a lot of data becomes the flavor of the month or the flavor of the year among people who engage in data visualization. And of course, recently it's been presidential elections and the COVID-19 pandemic. participants in the Data Visualization Society, like others who do data visualization, really do this work for a lot of reasons. Some people just do it because they think it's fun. Some people do it for their careers, to try and monetize their skills. But what's strikingly clear is that so many people who are doing data visualization are doing it without the knowledge of what I see as being two core components of data visualization. The first is humanities-driven data literacy. And the second is an informed sense of data visualization ethics. And this is actually something I've been thinking a lot about because I'm currently working with a colleague in computer science to develop a data science minor. And we've sort of had a lot of conversations about me saying, no, we really need a whole class in humanities approaches to data and data visualization. And fortunately, she agrees, but it's not something that sort of implicitly comes to mind for computer scientists or data scientists. Much like the processes in our own institutions where diversity and equity and inclusion get shunted off to a side committee, humanities-driven data literacy and data ethics are often understood as being adjuvants rather than central to the conversation about data visualization. And that's something I really think needs to change. We've seen a lot of maps and a lot of dashboards about COVID-19, and I think these are really great examples of how, if you're not attending to those aspects of data, then you can inadvertently misrepresent what's going on. And I mean, sometimes, let me be slightly less generous, there are people who are intentionally misrepresenting what's going on. I'm going to share my screen, and let's see, here we go, and show you what I mean. So this is, hopefully you can see, this is a chart of new cases of COVID from March of last year, which may appear innocuous when you look at it. But if you look at the y-axis, you can see that its scale goes 30, 60, 90, 100, 130, 160, 190, 240, 250, and so on. This scale is completely random. Sometimes it increases by 30, sometimes by 10, sometimes by 50, and that in turn affects the graph. And the graph would look substantially different if it were normalized to consistent intervals, or even if they had chosen to use the logarithmic scale. And a normalized version of this particular y-axis would actually give the impression that the virus is spreading more quickly than it looks like from this graph, which maybe is more quickly than Fox News wanted you to know. So maybe that's not unintentional misrepresentation. It's not clear. And then with maps, you know, there's this widely referenced and circulated map that apparently is the map behind it. See, there we go. It's loading. Okay. This is a dashboard with a map, and very typical of COVID maps. And you know what we have to remember, a map like this is not a progression over time. A map like this is a moment in time. It's based on raw numbers, so it's not normalized by population. So it's actually difficult to make comparisons between different countries about the relative spread of the virus. The circles are misleading because when you represent numerical data with circles, because of how we calculate area of a circle, a doubled number of cases doesn't look like a doubled size of the area of a circle. So, and then on top of that, when circles are sized kind of proportionally, so they're relatively large in relation to the scale of the map and its own geography, it may actually also end up being misleading about the extent or not of geographical or regional spread. Now, this isn't just a matter of bad data visualization. And it isn't just about the potential negative ramifications of public health. It's also a matter of inequity. In the case of COVID-19, for example, one might look at that and not realize that we've had a disproportionate experience of the virus for Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. These kinds of nuances can be so easily flattened by the act of putting dots or dots of varying sizes on a map. When I think about kind of what's happening here with the popularization of data visualizations, I think of the way that in digital humanities, we sometimes talk about the concept of the eternal September. And if you are a person of a certain age, you may remember that this term comes from an episode in the early 90s, in 1993, when America Online, which if you're a person not of a certain age, is a way we used to get on the internet in the early 90s, and it involved having a modem that made sounds when we dialed up into it and got to the internet. AOL began providing access to Usenet. And prior to this, Usenet would regularly experience an influx of users every September as people came onto college campuses and learned about Usenet. And then there'd be about a month of disruption as users acquainted themselves with the norms of the community. And then it leveled off and everything settled down. But when AOL got into the game, there was suddenly a constant influx of new users. They never stopped coming, and there was no end to the September where everything leveled off. It was simply an eternal September of constant adjustment. I've seen, at least for the last 5 years, this kind of eternal September of data visualization as various data producing crises or so-called crises lead people to just make pretty data visualizations because they can, or because they think they're helping, but they're doing it without a real sense of data ethics or a sense of humanistic data literacy. And what can end up happen is they can end up hurting rather than helping. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the very popular topics for data visualization was the so-called European refugee crisis or migrant crisis. Starting in 2014 or so, the European Union began seeing a marked influx in refugees and migrants arriving from across the Mediterranean Sea and overland from the Middle East and from Asia. And the European Commission was very quick to call this a migrant crisis, which would continue over several years, only to be declared over in 2019, though people continue to migrate. There are issues, of course, around geographical restrictions due to COVID-19 that have affected this, but people are still migrating. And the peak of migration in 2015 saw more than 1 million refugees, primarily Syrian, Afghani, and Iraqi, arriving typically in Italy or Greece, prompted by war. And the scale of forcibly displaced people is absolutely stunning. And I believe it's actually more people than were displaced by World War II. And because of the sheer amount of data that exists for the management and surveillance of migrants, it's also been catnip for people who want to do data visualization. And because, COVID-19 has distracted all of these people with new data sets, it's actually an opportune time to really take a look and take stock of what those data visualizations of migration can tell us. about the need for humanities-driven data literacy and data visualization ethics, and try to tease out what that even means. And what an ethics of care for data visualization that's situated between these two pillars might look like. This builds a little bit on some of the earlier work that I've done, examining what multimodal rhetoric can tell us about data visualizations of migration. And I've argued that with alarming frequency, these data visualizations play into the notion of a crisis and produce a sense that the migrant or the refugee is the problem. And in doing so, diverting the attention away from the geopolitical practices and policies of the global north that created the conditions that instantiated migration in the first place. This is very much for me a factor of how data visualizations look, how they are designed to look, and the lack of attention to how design choices encode particular messages about migration that the audiences then decode. And I'm referring here to Stuart Hall's work on his model of communication for media messages. Here we see the data visualizer using modes of communication like text and image and video and kinesthetics as symbols to communicate with the audience. And then the audience in turn interprets these symbols to communicate, to comprehend the message as a whole. Data visualizations of migration tend to encode an idea that migration is a problem through an interplay of written linguistic, visual, and spatial modes of communication that they deploy. And their reception, which we can look at through their circulation on social media and their republication in media outlets, suggests that audiences are in fact decoding these messages of the migrants are a problem, and a problem that threatens the so-called fortress Europe. I want to demonstrate how this plays out in a really well-received data visualization called The Flow Towards Europe, which was created by a Finnish startup called Lucify. And so this is sort of in the category of a data visualization firm wants to demonstrate the pretty things they can do with data visualization without really any content expertise or understanding of the problem. So this project uses a data set. I'm going to quickly scroll down for a second to show you the map. This may get wonky because it doesn't work as well over Zoom. But okay, so you can see this map. So this project uses a data set from the United Nations Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, and developed a visualization that depicts waves of migrants represented by dots traveling from countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia towards Central Europe. I think this is actually making my Zoom buggy, so I am going to drop the link for all of you so you can just look at it yourself. If I have panelists and attendees, okay, so you can check it out. So from its landing page, when you just click on that link, the Flow Towards Europe deploys written linguistic cues that present this migrant as a problem narrative. It begins with a note that accompanies the project, and this note states, Europe is experiencing the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. Based on the data from the United Nations, we clarify the scale of the crisis. This choice of crisis as a written linguistic cue automatically sets us up with this idea that the migrant is a problem and essentially instantiates a crisis by using the word crisis and telling you it's a crisis, right? And this is very much, as apparently I like Stuart Hall today, very much like the phenomenon that Stuart Hall and his colleagues described of the so-called mugging crisis in England in the 1970s, where the media's articulation and inflammation of a crisis in turn then produced and justified the policing of a crisis. So likewise, when the so-called refugee crisis is positioned as such, as a crisis, it then begs the question of what to do about it and how to stop it. And of course, in this instance, how to stop it isn't get at the root causes of why people are migrating in the first place, but how do we stop them from coming here? The linguistic choice to use refugee actually also obfuscates the complexities of migration, particularly around the categorization of migrants. And it misrepresents the data that's being used in this visualization. What it's actually depicting, even though it's not saying it, is the flows of asylum seekers to European countries over time. And if you're able to open the link and hover over individual countries, you'll be able to see details, including the number of people who arrived in a country in Europe or who left from a country outside of Europe since 2012. What this visualization actually omits is other categories of forced migrants that are not in this data set. So the scale of migration is actually much higher than is represented in this particular data visualization. So for example, 5.6 million Syrian refugees who are registered by the UN Refugee Agency under a different category are not represented. So in a visualization that's purporting to be a depiction of a refugee crisis, it's very curious that the category of Syrian refugee would be omitted, and that's not been made clear. Also completely absent in a project like this is any kind of written linguistic context for migration that would humanize those represented in the data set and reframe the problem as not one that's a problem that lies within migrants themselves, but of the geopolitical circumstances that have been produced by colonialism and neo-colonialism and the global north, which are actually the problem. The visual rhetoric of the flow towards Europe further contributes to this idea of the migrant as the problem. The primary visual choice here is a map, but what a map looks like, which continents and countries are centered, which are displaced, what the color schemes are, what the size choices are, what types of map, right? So are you using a political map, a physical map, topographical map, etc., all contribute to how migration is represented. Here, the flow towards Europe features European countries and thus the global north front and center, with countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East offset. And they're the primary sources of migrants, according to this data visualization. And so the rendering of Europe as this victim of a refugee crisis is reinforced by its visual mode. Even just the color scheme of the map and its dark-hued navy blue bodies of water and black countries and green national borders reinforces this sort of sense of foreboding. And using a political map absent of topographical features emphasizes national borders over land and depicts a kind of cohesion and insularity of the nation state, which is itself a fiction, particularly in the European Union. Along with these visual cues, the spatial mode emphasizes a violation of borders and nation states that's affected by migrants, represented here as these flowing dots. And depending on the kinds of visualizations you're looking at, sometimes you see lines, sometimes you see arrows, but really what's consistent is that migrants are disrupting the map. They are disrupting Europe, right? For the flow towards Europe, each dot represents 25 migrants moving across the map, traversing national borders, not staying where they seem to be belonging. And oddly enough, the choice to group migrants by 25 was simply determined by the limits of the visualization platform. There was no real rhyme or reason or consideration about what it might mean for the potential interpretation of the visualization. But the creators felt that if each migrant was a single dot, the visualization would be too crowded, or it may not run swiftly enough. It might get buggy. So instead, these dots appear as unimpeded waves, emphasizing the magnitude of migration. But this is also a very poor representation of migration, which rarely takes the case, a form of travel from point A to point B as the crow flies. And migration also doesn't occur uniformly over time in the kinds of flows depicted by the data visualization. But because the UNHCR data is reported monthly, the composers evenly distributed migrants throughout each month and then created departure dates that weren't in the original data set, which they calculated based on the arrival date, the distance traveled, and speed. But for speed, they used average human walking pace, despite the fact that migration occurs by multiple means of transportation, and nobody was walking across the Mediterranean Sea. And so the result is this narrative of uniform waves of migrants over time that inflame that kind of written linguistic invocation of a crisis that they already set us up with. And furthermore, the conversion of migrants into dots is a move that's dehumanizing, that strips, that reduces them to numbers, that strips them of context that would shed light on the complexities of migration. And what's worse is that this kind of transgression of national boundaries by seamless flows of dots reinforces what we've seen in Europe and we've seen this in the US too, anti-migrant rhetoric and public discourse that positions migrants as threats to national identity, economy, security, and borders. While I'm not convinced that this was the motivation of Lucify, which seems to be in the category of creating data visualizations because you can, the kind of you have a hammer so everything looks like a nail approach to data visualization. A lot of people are motivated to create data visualizations on data-rich topics that involve vulnerable people out of a sense of altruism. As if data visualization itself is going to undo the effects of centuries of oppression. And I don't say this to diminish the power that data visualizations can have. I think they can change people's minds. I think they can make people see things in a new way, maybe even change the world. But there's also sort of a somewhat techno-utopian sense of what data visualizations can do that really asks us to think about their limits. So if what I just showed you was a matter of what not to do, then that begs the question of what are the considerations for how to do this type of work better? What is a humanities-driven data literacy? And what is an ethics of care for data visualization of migration that's grounded in data visualization ethics? Unlike the Lucify approach to migration data visualization, which is essentially find some data, put it on a map, data visualization, particularly when it's related to vulnerable populations of people, really requires us to think through what methodologies might look like in a completely different way. So an ethics of care for data visualization actually can't be some kind of blanket checklist of how to do this right, or some kind of hegemonic notion of what to do, but rather of the kinds of questions that we must generate and we must ask, particularly of in relation to the vulnerable populations whose experiences are being visualized. I do want to note that there are other ways of creating data visualization specifically about 21st century European migration that are good examples, but they are few and far between. One fantastic example is a project called XOD, which was a visualization that was, here you go, that was created using the testimonies of a little over 2,600 migrants from sub-Saharan Africa who had come to Italy. And this project consists of a web map of testimonies from migrants that were collected by Doctors for Human Rights in Italy between 2014 and 2017. And what the project really does well is that it foregrounds the humanity of migrants. It foregrounds their stories and their challenges and the pain and the violence that made the arduous and often traumatic process of migration the only optimal choice for them. This project, as you can see from looking at just this page that I'm showing you, features an articulation of roots that are absent in other data visualizations that are created based on UN data, or the other most frequently used data set for migration data, which is from the International Organization for Migration, the IOM. And it also, but more critically, depicts roots in ways that are sensitive, that don't compromise the safety of other migrants. They're not that detailed, but at least they sort of show you that this is not a point A to point B kind of situation. And it offers context for the influx of European refugees in a way that refutes the idea that migrants are themselves the problem. Another important example in this vein is the project Crossing the Mediterranean Sea by Boat, which was created by researchers at the University of Warwick in the UK. This project is based on 250 qualitative interviews with migrants. It also captures roots of migration, again, in a thoughtful way that avoids exposing the details in a way that might make it easy to police those roots. It also illuminates the social and political reasons that subtend migration and really places the responsibility on the global north where it belongs. And it really also gives due to the humanity of migrants by describing them in relational terms. So you can see right here, it's a brother escaping civil war, 3 female friends escaping sexual violence, a husband, father, and son escaping social ostracism. So we sort of see people rather than seeing dots. Now, with projects like these, it's often easy to simply attribute the differences between them and something like the flow towards Europe as simply a matter of quantitative versus qualitative data. But we can't simply reduce the issue to that. Instead, we need to be thinking about the value of mixed methods. So actually, XOD, SOD integrates quantitative data to tell its stories. And we also need to be thinking about how we can approach using quantitative data from a different perspective. And this is what a group of friends and I, including KU's own Sylvia Fernandez, did in 2018 when we undertook the project Torn Apart Separados, a rapid response research project that responded to the family separation policy that was implemented by the US government at the Mexico-US border. When we undertook Torn Apart Separados, which we researched, developed, and launched in the span of one incredibly busy and sleepless week, it was, in a sense, driven by an altruistic question. What can a team of librarians, graduate students, and faculty with digital humanities skills do to respond to the situation? We were never under any illusions that we were going to solve the family separation crisis, but as we watched so many of our colleagues rightfully feeling so helpless, we thought we could at least try to see if we could do anything to be useful. And what we ended up producing were data stories of migration, but ones that take a markedly different tactic, from which I'm able to actually kind of extrapolate some precepts for humanities-driven data approaches and an ethics of care for data visualization. And let me just show you the project very quickly. Okay, So this is what the project looks like. So the sort of first precept I'm able to pull out is that the question really needs to start not at how to undertake visualization, but whether to do it. So the story behind this project is that in late May of 2018, the news came out about the US government losing 5,000 immigrant children. And Alex Heel, one of the Torn Apart team members, and I began doing research into this situation, trying to understand what was going on, thinking about whether we can mobilize our skills with digital humanities and data visualization to do something. What we quickly realized ahead of the news cycle was that these weren't actually the children who were being separated from families at the border, that they were actually unaccompanied minor children who had arrived at the border. And these two stories were being conflated. What we learned through this process was that when unaccompanied minors arrive at the border, they are put into this system created by the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, and they're then placed with family and sponsors. If the Office of Refugee Resettlement is unable to contact the children, their family, or sponsors after 30 days with a phone call, they were considered to be lost. Through our research and through conversations with people who were working with unaccompanied minors and their families, we were able to ascertain, and also this is verified with government data, that 90% of children were placed with family, not placed with sponsors. And that also there were sponsors who were connected in networks seeking to reunite children with undocumented family members. And so for undocumented people who are trying to avoid deportation, being lost, that is not being found, may actually be the best thing. So we abandoned this idea that there was anything to do about the situation other than help correct misinformation about these so-called lost children. But a few weeks later, the news cycle turned to the family separation policy with these heart-wrenching stories about children being ripped from their parents' arms. And this question came up again. Is there anything we can do? And more critically, is there anything we should do? So this brings me to the next precept, which is recognizing what kinds of knowledges and expertise are crucial to doing a project like this well. We set up a team of researchers, so Alex Heel, Manan Ahmed, Sylvia Fernandez, Mayra Alvarez, Marissa Martinez, and Linda Rodriguez, and later Rachel Hendry joined us for the second volume of the project. We knew we needed a lot of different kinds of expertise. We needed scholars with deep knowledge of the borderlands, of migration, of media. We needed skills in data visualization and data curation, data modeling, project management, and someone really good at finding stuff on the internet. That was me. I'm very good at finding stuff on the internet. At the outset of our wild week, we didn't even really know what kind of project might emerge. We didn't start out as hammers with nails. We just decided to take 3 days and do some research on immigrant detention and related data and just see what we could find. We really weren't, and we knew we weren't going to do a data visualization that would rehearse a narrative of immigrant invasion, but wanted to put focus on the real problem, on the US government, and perhaps make some kind of small contribution. And we had this kind of vague sense that if we could map the detention centers, we could raise awareness of the pervasiveness of immigrant detention. And if we could identify the shelters where children were being held, we might be able to get the information into the hands of social workers and lawyers who are working on the ground at the border, trying to reunite families and maybe be of some assistance. And maybe if we got the media somehow to be interested in what we were doing, we could get the word out. So we needed expertise beyond academia, and also without putting a larger burden on people like social workers while they were already doing really, really critical work. And the insights that emerge just from dedicating time to research leads to my next point, which is that data visualization just can't be about the data that you can easily find, but also has to be about, or at least you have to take into account the possibility of data sets that you can create. If we had just relied on telling stories of migration based on data that was available to us, we'd be telling stories through the gaze of the state. And instead, what we were able to do was put the gaze on the state. Within 2 days of research, during which we abandoned pretty much everything else in our lives, we had found and verified a list of immigrant detention centers, and we hand compiled a list of the 113 children's shelters where the government was housing children, just through rabbit holes of research. There was no list. There's no public information. We were looking through random government documents, nonprofit tax documents, which I had randomly learned about in a grant workshop and thought, I wonder if they're these organizations, they're nonprofits. I wonder if their tax documents tell us anything. Social media, good old fashioned Google phone number and address listings. And 5 days later, we released volume 1 of the project with our series of data visualizations that sliced the data in a number of different ways, from the more concrete map of detention centers, which is the sort of first iconic image, and you can see it right here on the screen. So here are the large orange dots are detention centers that were, as of 2018, in use since 2014. The little orange dots were contracted. They were not in use, but they were contracted to ICE, to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, for use should it be necessary. And then it's a little bit probably harder to see right now on Zoom, but there are purple dots, and these purple dots are actually the children's shelters. So this was very concrete data visualization, and then the other ones get slightly more abstract. Later in the summer of 2018, we released volume 2, which you can see over here. And volume 2 was the result of following the money trail, designing a series of data visualizations based on 20,000 government contracts given out by Immigration and Customs Enforcement to fund immigrant detention. So what this work all reflects is another key issue, which is that what kinds of data tell what kinds of stories. So what these data visualizations do differently than something like the flow towards Europe is that the gaze on the state that I mentioned before calls into question the state and its infrastructure of immigrant detention. This first image, the visualization I showed you, which we call clinks, we were trying to show that the carceral state is the problem, that ICE is everywhere, not just at the border. It permeates the landscape of all of our lives. The visualizations get more abstract as we tried to address other challenges of storytelling, data storytelling with migration, and experimenting with genres of data visualization. So the visualization called The Trap, what just happened here? The visualization called The Trap is trying to tell the story of how the border is itself a trap. I don't know why this is acting so strange. Let's see. It shows how the border is itself a trap, depicting the 100-mile border zone where migrants are exposed to harsh geographical conditions of the desert, and also at that particular moment were intentionally being blocked from seeking asylum at the ports of entry, which are represented. I don't know if screen sharing is going to show you my mouse, but you can see along the southern edge of this orange orange stripe, these semicircular indentations. And those semicircular indentations are the ports of entry. And what was happening in 2018 is that Border Patrol was blocking the ports of entry and stopping people. And so people out of desperation were instead crossing the border in these spaces in between the ports of entry, where because of the laws, their border crossing is criminalized. So just one final point that I want to make as well is that we must attend to the ethical implications of the data. And it's going to look weird because the aspect ratio is bizarre on Zoom, but our visualization ORR, which stands for Office of Refugee Resettlement, tells the story of some of the ethical issues that we confronted after compiling the data on children's shelters. So while we worked, we repeatedly debated whether or not we should make the addresses of the children's shelter available to anyone easily online in a compiled format. And the main issue was that we had the only aggregated list with the addresses of children's shelters. And we were concerned, particularly at the height of media attention, that well-meaning people without experience organizing, without experience working with vulnerable children might just show up there at these sites to protest and potentially invite state violence onto an already vulnerable population of children. And at that time, what we were actually seeing is people showing up at airports where children were being transited to shelters, because as you can see, the shelters were not all along the border. So the children are being traumatized by all these really well-meaning people shouting in languages that they may not understand. And so we were really worried about that. So we decided against it. And so the ORR visualization tries to tell that story by evoking both the need to protect that data as well as the slipperiness of ICE and the entire operation of immigration enforcement itself. So you might expect when you click on a dot on a map that it gives you a tooltip with more information. But what happens here when you try and click over it is the dot disappears. Oh, and it eludes your grasp, and you can't get the data. Now, these are JSON objects, so anybody who knows how to could scrape the data out of our site, but most people aren't able to do that. And honestly, if you're able to do it and wanting to go to that extra step, go at it. Because our project was the subject of a Wired article, as I mentioned, we were trying to court the media because we thought, let's get media attention for the project and let's get the word out that this project exists and is out there. And that way, hopefully social workers and lawyers who are working with people and families at the border could contact us, and we would just give them our data if it would be useful. We courted the media and then some, and then ended up in this position of having to decide how and under what circumstances we would share our data set. So, we were approached by Washington Post, we were approached by ProPublica, we were approached by design firms who wanted to make pretty data visualizations, and also social workers and lawyers. And the ones we refused were ProPublica, because ProPublica simply wanted to make a map with the data and make it available easily to everyone, and to the design firms, because as examples like the Flow Towards Europe show us, the corporate impulse to make impressive data visualizations can have problematic consequences for audiences' interpretation of migration. So by taking this different approach to visualizing migration, one that does not dehumanize migrants themselves and instead emphasizes the dehumanization wrought by the state, Torn Apart Separados offers a different kind of approach to telling stories with data about migration that also exemplifies what humanities-driven data literacy and data visualization ethics can look like in this particular instance. And as I said before, the considerations are essentially the same, but the answers you come to will be different depending on what kind of context you're working with. And in the context of migration, new approaches really do hold possibilities for disrupting the way that users envision mobile populations and reimagine the spatial relations of migration, and in turn challenge public discourse around migration. So just to recap, what I'm advocating for is an ethics of care for data visualization that stops to examine whether data visualization is the right methodology given what you are hoping to achieve and what problems you're trying to solve. That recognizes what kinds of knowledges and expertise are crucial to doing data visualization well. To focus not on the data you can easily find, but also the data sets that you can create depending on what your goal is. Understands what kinds of data tell what kinds of stories, and also what kinds of stories you can't tell with data. And finally, to always attend to the ethical implications of the data that's in your care. And by looking for new approaches grounded in humanities-driven data literacy and data visualization ethics, we can, I believe, more fully realize the possibilities of the stories that we can tell with data. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the question and answers. Well, the questions.
Thank you so much, Roopika. We're now open to any questions, comments, and thoughts about data visualizations and mapping.
Well, if we don't have questions yet, Sylvia, do you want to just have a conversation? Because I know you've done really amazing work with mapping and data through your own like Borderlands Archives cartography and United Fronteras.
Yes, I think what you just talk about, Roopika, it's the double labor that it's being done, because you just mentioned about not only rely on public data sets, because sometimes those data sets don't reflect what is really happening in this transition geographical spaces. And it's a work that it's sometimes to contact people that are in vulnerable positions of asking them questions about their trajectories. So for instance, are we creating a map that we're giving the government the particular places where these migrants are stopping? Or are we trying to visualize this complexity in talking about migration, talking about movement? So that's why I really thought what you just mentioned, the ethics are really important, and the connection of adding words to a visualization. So a visualization doesn't tell you everything. It adds to what you want to show, not to rely on this to make policies or to think of representations of a particular community.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. I mean, I think, I think when we were doing Torn Apart, one of the things we were talking about is, what we're not trying to do is tell the government how to build a better immigrant detention system, right? And in a way, I mean, I feel like when you look at Flow Towards Europe, I mean, they're basically saying, hey, this needs to be stopped. This needs to be governed better. And that was sort of something that was explicitly contrary to what we were trying to do with Torn Apart. Looks like we have a question. Oh, we have some questions. Okay, so what steps do you recommend to take to find data from outside the state and other colonial structures? That's a really, really good question. I was talking to colleagues who were working in Europe with European migrants, and I think part of it is that moving beyond the data that we get from institutions, which I mentioned before, is data that exists to surveil and data that exists to manage populations. Jill Walker-Repberg has a really great article called Situated Data, and I loved it so much I actually asked her if I could interview her and we can have a conversation about it for Nightingale, which is the Journal of the Data Visualization Society. And she and I are really talking about this concept of how data is situated. And when we look at data, particularly data when it comes from a colonial structure, the kinds of questions we need to be asking are, who collected this data? Why were they collecting this data? Who was in the position to make decisions around the controlled vocabulary of the data, or the kinds of terminology that has been given to people? You know, we all experience this routinely when we're asked to identify our ethnicity or racial background, or we're asked to identify our gender, right? And it's a very different experience of when you're given it. Well, it depends on who's written the survey, right? Of what kinds of options you get to talk about your identity. And so the conversations I've had with colleagues who've been doing work with people in Europe who are refugees is largely around empowering communities and giving communities the tools or whatever support they need to produce their data, if they want, on their own terms and in their own words. So my colleagues I've done a little bit of work with at, why is the name escaping me? The university, it's in wow, it's in the Netherlands, and for some reason I cannot remember the name of it right now. But I have colleagues in the Netherlands, Koenlers, for example. They have a big lab in media and migration, and they do all kinds of work with refugees in the Netherlands and do that work. Sylvia mentioned before that I'm a co-editor of a journal called Reviews in Digital Humanities, and we actually reviewed a project called Humanizing Deportation. And I believe it's out of one of the University of California universities. And
Davis?
UC Davis, thank you. Sylvia, you edited this special issue that it was in. And it's a project, but what it does is is essentially equip migrants with the tools, the technology, and whatever assistance they need if they want to tell their stories. And that's, I think, the different kind of approach that tries to get outside the colonial structures, because in the colonial structures, the ones that are sort of determining the vocabulary, determining what knowledge is, determining what data is. And if we actually move away from that, then we can do that. And the short answer is, it's a lot more work.
Exactly. I think this one goes connected to that, and it's, thank you for your great presentation, Roopika, and it's great to see you here at KU. Unfortunately, it's virtually. I'm thinking about the emotional labors of doing DH work, that it's based on difficult subjects such as migration. Is this something you might like to speak to? James Jekyll.
Hi, James. It's so nice to virtually see you, and I wish I were there. That is such a good question. It's a question I've actually been thinking about quite a lot lately. It was a question we, and Sylvia probably concur, that we were dealing with Torn Apart, because spending your time constantly meditating on this sort of horrible tragedy is very hard. I mean, I just remind myself, like, this is sitting here and researching things is way easier than living it. And for me also, I mean, my family is from Kashmir. Kashmir has been subject to a battle between India and Pakistan since 1947. It's sort of sometimes been fine. It's sometimes been bad. It's currently bad. And my parents were pretty keen to leave. It's not I still have family there, but they wanted out. And so, you know, for me, they went to England, and then I was born in England, and then they came to the US. Actually, I was born in Wales, but then they came to the US. And so, but for me, the experience of migration was, well, just fairly easy. And so I just remind myself, you know, this was so easy for me. And I was a child too, but so I just count my lucky stars and remind myself like it's way easier to be able to do research than it is to be doing research and living it, right? And so but I have been thinking about this a lot lately, because also, yeah, I've been doing research on the phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and kind of the media mobilization around that. And, you know, it really gets to, there are moments and times where you just have to stop, because you end up so saturated with pain and trauma. And I was also thinking about this recently. I did a data visualization workshop for colleagues at Spelman College in Atlanta on Zoom. And at the request of the person who invited me, we used the transatlantic slave trade data set as the sample data set that we would all work on. And as I was cleaning the data so that it could be used for this project, you know, I came across the Salem, Massachusetts disembarkations, where enslaved people were brought to Salem, Massachusetts. And in fact, if you look right under the U of university in my background, that is where I live. And it is 1 block away from the port where enslaved people were brought to Salem. And it was just this moment of thinking, oh my gosh. And it's like, and I knew this, right? I knew this is part of the Salem's history, even though the National Park Service pretends it's not. But there was something about working with that data set and just being confronted with the magnitude it really took my breath away. And then I thought, my colleagues who I've been asked to lead this workshop with, and I've been asked by them to use this data set, many of them are African-American, and many of them will have a very different experience of this data set than I did. And to create space to acknowledge that, to create space for people to talk about that was, I think that was really important. And then we also really to think about, if we do this work with our students, to be thinking about, how do we acknowledge that for them? How do we create space for them to do it?
Yes, I totally remember, Roopika, when we were doing Torn Apart, how there were days that we couldn't sleep because we were crying, we were exchanging messages. But I think also the work in collaboration is something crucial, of how we support each other and how we know that it will affect others differently. And continuing, there's several questions, and some of them, just compiling them, they are asking for some resources or places where they can find other kinds of data for learning more about humanities, data-driven literacy ethics. But other questions that I think, whichever you want to respond, is, can knowledge production or curricula be decolonized?
Who follows me on Twitter who saw me ranting about that last night?
Exactly. And Lisbeth de la Cruz Santa, who has been participating in Humanizing Deportation, mentions, thank you, Roopika, for this wonderful presentation. I'm wondering if you could speak about sustainability approaches for DH projects that make data visible through mapping. And the 2 last ones is, has there been an effort to discuss unethical mapping methods with corporate firms? If so, how did they respond? How can we combine them to reanalyze their work? And lastly, Bobby Cervantes, thank you, Roopika. How do you think memory studies plays a role in DH projects? about migration. Any ideas on including memory studies openly in disciplines that may not be as open to it, history, political economy, etc.?
Okay, that's a lot of questions, but let me see if I can do my best. So on the question of memory studies, so the digital Black Atlantic volume comes out at some point. I found that during the pandemic, what it means to have a book publication date appears to be completely amorphous now. The book was supposed to be out on the 23rd. Amazon now says it's shipping March 9th. It is unclear to me when this book will be out, but sometime soon. There is a chapter by Sonia Donaldson on work she's been doing on ephemeral archives of media. And she does a really good job there of talking about the relationship between memory studies, like Nora's work and Pierre Nora's work and digital humanities. And I think that's been super. It's a really great essay, and I think you should take a look at it. And I think it'll give you a great example, because her context of her project is video representations of Lift Every Voice and Sing. Sometimes that's called the Black National Anthem. And she, memory studies and Black studies aren't necessarily things that people put together, but it's a great example of how to do it. And so that might be helpful. On the issue of unethical mapping methods with corporate firms, yes, people certainly have tried. There's really one really good example. There's a lab on mapping Indigenous locations that's at the University of Victoria. And off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of the person who leads it, but they've had a really productive collaboration with Google on Google Maps. And at first, I got my Google, but they've actually, through their work, managed to get Indigenous place names onto the Google map for the around Vancouver region of British Columbia and like a little bit further afield in British Columbia. And I think that's actually a really good example in which, they took money from Google, but they used it to try and push Google to make some changes that, think about geography in a better way. Along those lines, if you go to Twitter, you can see me having feelings about knowledge production or curricula being decolonized. And really a sort of fun moment when social work colleagues from my university start fighting with me about it and saying it is just semantics to say that you can't decolonize curriculum. The context is that my university, like so many, decided to put on some kind of series on quote unquote decolonizing the curriculum. And what they actually mean is including more Black and people of color, because they really actually aren't thinking about Indigenous people, Black and people of color on syllabi, but they're calling this decolonization. And I very much believe in the work of Eve Tuck and Kei-Wei Yang and their argument that decolonization is not a metaphor, that decolonization is about land back. And of course, it's important that we include voices on syllabi. We include Indigenous voices, include Black, Latinx, Asian voices, but also that is not decolonization. Decolonization is land back. If you don't know about the land back movement, I suggest looking it up. They have a great manifesto. It's also, for people who think that that the idea of decolonization meaning giving land back is something that is practically not achievable. It's because if we don't come from a background where our knowledge base is shaped by Indigenous knowledge, we have a very different perception of what it means to own land. That is very much through the capitalist frame of real estate. And it's totally doable. And I keep saying this to my university, but one day they'll agree with me. And then sustainability, that one, I think really the issue around sustainability is, there's no guarantee that that the internet, I mean, if you were used to using websites with Flash, and you've now discovered that sometimes formats stop being supported, and therefore things don't work anymore. The best way to deal with that is to to preserve your data in flat formats in which it can be reused. So what we did with Torn Apart actually is we ended up creating GitHub repositories, and we created one for the data. And we eventually, once the media cycle had passed and nobody really cared about separated children anymore in the media, we put the data in the data repository in CSV formats, and so anybody can take it and use it, and it is reusable. It can be ported into whatever the new kind of way of doing data visualization is, and that I think is really a key to sustainability. On the final question of resources for learning more about humanities, data-driven literacy and ethics, I think it's very useful to kind of look into scholarship on indigenous data cultures. There's a special issue on that, or rather there's a good article on that by one of the authors is Jennifer Giuliano. That's in the Journal of Cultural Analytics. That is very useful, but there's also a lot of really wonderful work by Indigenous scholars on this. Also, it's worth checking out Data for Black Lives, which is a movement of activists and organizers and mathematicians who are trying to think about using data science more effectively. So those are just two places to start. And also, if you want to, I'll put my email in the chat. And so if that's something you want to email about kind of more things to read, please email, because as I mentioned, I'm working on data science minor. So this is all in my head right now. So thank you.
Roopsie, thank you so much. As you saw, there are a lot of reactions because these kind of talks are so much needed, and I will forward you all the remaining questions. But other than that, thank you so much. Gracias. Un abrazo and take care, everyone. Thank you for your extra time in this talk, and see you around. Follow Roopika in Twitter, which a lot of these questions, she will post answers to them through her post.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Bye.